Welcome to the Sober Podcast, brought to you by the Sober Network. The Sober Network is actively engaged in revolutionizing the recovery community. We offer fresh ideas, voices, and incentives to impact massive social change. Our technology expertise is best seen in our multiple brands. They demonstrate a thorough understanding of how we get things done. Take us along on your journey, and we will help build the recovery capital needed to sustain life on life's terms. Visit us at sobernetwork.com.
Welcome to the Sober Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Brickhouse. And before we get started, I'd like to take a minute to get the word out about one of our latest product lines brought to you by Soberverse, Sober Life Apparel, where positivity and pride pave the way to a brighter, healthier future. Please visit our new website, Sober Life, that's SOBRLIFE.com, and check out the new merchandise. Our sober celebrity guest today is Jessica Leahy. Jess is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Gift of Failure: How the Best Parents Learn to Let Go so Their Children Can Succeed, and The Addiction Inoculation: Raising Healthy Kids in a Culture of Dependence. Jess was awarded the Research Society on Alcohol's Media Award for outstanding journalistic efforts of writers who cover empirical research on alcohol for her book, The Addiction Inoculation, and advocacy for the recovery community. Jess, thank you for joining us.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for having me.
Glad that you're here, and wanted to talk today with you about substance use prevention and talking to the kids about resisting substance use. And wanted to know, or start off with, what in your own youth led to the focus on protecting children and adolescents from abusing substances?
Yeah, no surprise there. I was raised by an alcoholic I have a parent who was raised by an alcoholic, and I have a grandparent who, and so on and so on and so on. And the one thing I knew when I was young is that I would never do that. Like, I would never end up using and being an alcoholic like my parent. And
of course not.
Oh, of course not. No. And that's exactly where I landed. I got sober when I was 43. So it's been 10 years. But I was in trouble for a while before that, for a long while before that. I knew I was in trouble. And it was you would think that even having the experience of being raised by someone with substance use disorder, even having been a peer drug and alcohol counselor in college, like, I had all the knowledge. I just couldn't square the two things. And all I knew was my kids were getting old enough that they were going to notice soon. And luckily for me, my dad was the person who came in and said, you really need help. And I was at the right moment to be able to hear that.
Yeah. What, so you are a parent, and what do these conversations look like with your kids?
So I got sober when my kids were 12 and how old was it? Something like 6 and 12 or 7 and 12. And, we were right at the right place, that they were old enough to be able to understand what it meant. And we'd had conversations before that, like, they knew that one of their grandparents was an alcoholic or is an alcoholic, because it had blown up, family holidays and things like that. And we never.
That's where you can really see the alcoholism.
Well, and, it blew up a Christmas one year due to a relapse, and I was never willing to lie to them. And except about my own drinking. Of course, that was the one thing I was willing to lie to anybody about, including myself. Right. But, when that Christmas blew up, my sister and I, we were a unified front with our kids, and we left and we canceled Christmas essentially in that form. And we talked to them about it. So, and I also knew, once I'd done the research for the addiction inoculation, what it meant to have a genetic predisposition for substance use disorder. And I understood that I didn't have time to mess around and not talk about it. So we talk about it a lot, and we talk about it just in the sense of, not using, and you're at the adolescent brain and why it's so much more damaging to the adolescent brain. But we also have conversations like, look, if you're using weed, what does it look like? Or if you're drinking, what does it look like, feel like when it moves from casual use to something a little more ominous? We have those conversations a lot because, my kids are now almost 25 and almost 20. And so now our conversations have very much shifted toward, here's the warning signs that you need to be on alert for if things start to get a little scary with you and your substance use.
Yeah. Yeah. I believe that there is a genetic predisposition to alcohol and substance abuse. And, it runs on my father's side of the family. And no matter how much knowledge we have growing up, or and we see our firsthand experience of the destructive effects of alcohol and substance abuse, but sometimes it can't stop us from
no. And
like
that's
in
one
your
of the
case.
things.
But what I think is great about what's happening now, in this, in the last generation, that we're much more open about alcoholism and addiction, and about treating it, and about people in recovery, so that even if it's not going to stop you from becoming an alcoholic or an addict, but you're going to have some knowledge of what to do
we're at a really amazing time where not only can we look inside the human brain and see what's going on at various stages and ages in life, and we can see what's happening in the brains of kids who use, for example, a kid who uses weed on a regular basis, on more than twice a week, has a smaller hippocampus than a kid who doesn't, or has a smaller, thinning of the frontal lobe, that kind of thing. But also we have a better idea of what the genetic picture looks like. We now know that genetics is about 50 to 60% of the risk picture when it comes to developing substance use disorder later on in life. We know that the younger a kid is when they first try substances, the higher their lifelong risk of developing substance use disorder. And most importantly, we know, looking at the adolescent brain, that it is not done developing until the early to mid 20s, and that it is at increased risk for damage due to substances during that time.
Yeah. You also teach in Vermont, right? About
I
lead
had
classes on for adolescents on substance abuse disorder.
So actually what I've done, so I was a teacher in middle school and high school for a long time. I then taught in a rehab for adolescents. So I was teaching kids who were actually in rehab. And then for the past 2 years, I was working at SANA at Stowe, which is a medical detox and recovery, evidence-based, research-based detox and recovery. And but for people 18 and up. So I was working with adults, and if they had kids, we would have a lot of conversations about, like, here's ways to talk to your kids about this. Here are ways to understand your kids' risk, and ways that the most evidence, sort of most proven ways to talk to kids about substance use disorder that can actually decrease their risk of substance use disorder over their lifetime, as opposed to things like, the early iterations of DARE that actually increased kids' risk of developing substance use disorder.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the Stinky and Dirty show. I believe it teaches kids problem solving and was adapted from your curriculum. But
I love Stinky and Dirty. Actually, we had the book when my kids were little. We had the books that the Stinky and Dirty show were based on. We had a book called I Stink, about a dump truck. And I got a call from someone who was working with Amazon saying, do you want to be a part of helping create this show? And at first I said, no, I don't want to be a part of creating more screen time for kids. But then I realized the person who was asking me was the creator of Blue's Clues, and her name is Alice Wilder. And you do not say no to Alice Wilder. She's amazing. And so I got to be a part of this incredible show that really is about helping kids learn how to make mistakes and learn from their mistakes and be innovative and creative and resourceful. And I love the Stinky and Dirty show. I really do.
Well, you also hold the honor of having one of your articles adapted into an SAT prompt. Tell us what that was, how that
It's
ended up.
As a former teacher, I had to issue this massive blanket. I'm so sorry, not only to my students, but to my own children. And actually, the reason I found out about it, I did not know it was going to be an SAT question. I found out about it because one of my friend's kids came home from taking the SAT and said, Jess is on the SAT. And then I started getting attacked on Twitter by high school students. And it's a thing. Apparently, I did not know this. My son told me it is a thing to make SAT memes, or it used to be a thing on Twitter. And I became an SAT meme on Twitter, and I saved all of them because they're very funny. But it was essentially people taking jabs at me, high schoolers taking jabs at me on Twitter, and I loved it.
That's great.
It was
Well,
great.
I hope you end up as a Jeopardy question soon.
Wouldn't that be amazing? That's when you know you've hit the pinnacle right there. As a New York Times crossword puzzle clue or as a Jeopardy clue, that's when you know you've really made it.
Let's talk a little bit more about how you teach the dangers of alcohol and drugs when it's so ingrained in our culture, in advertisements and
Yeah, that's a great point.
and
Essentially,
TV shows and
yeah, accurate information really is the goal going all the way through. And really great information, not just about drugs and alcohol, but about how their brains work in terms of like learning. The more a kid understands about how their brain works and why it's important to sort of keep their brain safe during adolescence, the better they're able to sort of give a context. This isn't just like, oh, don't drink because it's bad. The kids, adolescents in particular, and I'm not so great with the just do it because I said so kind of approach.
right.
The just say no sort of approach doesn't
just
work.
say no didn't work. I don't believe.
Right. Giving them a lot of information about what the harm that does to their brain, and then helping debunk some of these myths that you're talking about. That, everybody does it is not a valid argument because, for example, we know it, for example, in 8th grade, if kids are going to be trying alcohol, it's, usually somewhere during middle school is when it begins. The argument that everybody does it is not true. It turns out that only 24.7% of middle school students, of 8th grade students, are going to try alcohol by the end of 8th grade. So, if they have that information, at least in their head, they can say, hold on, I know that's not true. It sort of empowers them, helps them feel like they have more self-efficacy. And then having refusal skills, which is one of my favorite parts of the book that isn't really, I can't take credit for. It was all adolescents who gave me their favorite excuses for why they're not going to drink or use drugs if they're out at a party and they want to save face. So it's like 2.5 pages of the coolest excuses. And, no is a complete sentence, or no thank you is a complete sentence, but all kinds of great excuses like, I have an early practice in the morning. I'm gluten intolerant, can't have that beer. I'm taking antibiotics. I have a sleep disorder. I get migraines. All of these excuses are absolutely fantastic. And if they want to throw us under the bus and say something like, oh, I can't, my mom drug tests, she'll know, and I'll be, grounded for the rest of my life. Even if that's not true, throw me under the bus. That's fine.
I love it. Do you, in talking to your kids about your history and alcoholism, do you talk about your recovery and what that looks like and how you got sober?
Yeah, it's been a part of their lives now for 10 years. And actually, when we were on vacation together, when I celebrated my 10th anniversary, and now that they're out there in the world and have met people, who had possibly an alcoholic as a parent, or someone who has an active alcoholic as a parent, it was the first time I sort of got this sense from me that they were grateful that I made that decision to go and get help. And I get, also I have kids who like to mock me on a constant basis. And so, there's the whole, like, if my daughter had a friend over, we tend to take in strays over the holidays. Like if people can't make it home from college over the Thanksgiving or whatever, they come here. And my daughter had a friend here who's from a country where the legal drinking age is 18. And so in their country, it would have been legal. But I explained that in our house, if you're not of legal drinking age, you don't drink alcohol. And my daughter made all kinds of jokes about it and stuff like that. But I'm never going to be cool to them. So I'm okay with the fact that, I'm a fairly dorky parent and they've had to grow up with, the gift of failure mom and, the addiction inoculation mom. And sort of, they knew what they were in for from the beginning. And I talked to them about my writing as I go along, and both of my kids love to write. So
yeah,
having that have been part of this research and writing process, they know most of what I know. And so if I were to do anything other than sort of best practices for parents, they could call me on that too.
And speaking of best practices for parents, what advice do you give to parents who want to highlight the dangers of addiction if they themselves drink?
Yeah. So one of the things I get to talk about in the book is that actually really good substance use prevention for kids starts literally in nursery school, preschool, kindergarten. And it's just talking to kids about, what we put inside of our bodies and what stays outside of our bodies, and how we speak up for ourselves if something makes us feel uncomfortable. If there's a bottle of prescription medication on the counter and your kid is learning their letters, saying things like, "Sweetie, can you find the letters of mommy's name on this label?" And then talking to them about why it's important to read the label and know whose name on it. Is it because you can't take something that's prescribed for someone else? And that, later on down the road becomes the entry point for a discussion about misusing, pain medications, for example, that have been prescribed for someone else.
Even if you have the same last name, you can't take them?
Sadly, no. And so moving through those conversations all the way up. And, we've gotten to a place now, actually, where both of my children have lost acquaintances to overdose, to poisoning, because it was fentanyl. One of my daughter lost a classmate to that. Classmate thought, they were just buying a bar of Xanax and going to have a good time after graduation, and was dead when their parent came to find them the next morning. And my niece has two friends that they were just going to have a good time and try some ecstasy, and both of them died, 18-year-old girls. So we now have these very real contexts, unfortunately, in which to put this stuff. And I'm really happy to say, actually, that my parent is in recovery now. I'm in recovery. My sister, I've become sort of the aunt who talks to the nieces also about the substance use disorder stuff. So, I lead with that. And, I lead with the fact that I have a queer kid. I lead with the fact that I, have substance use disorder, and that makes me someone safe for people with substance use disorder to talk to. All of these things I think are more important for us to talk about, because that reduces shame and blame and guilt. And there's no room for that, whether you have a kid who's, doesn't adhere to, for example, a gender norm, or doesn't adhere to, a mental health standard. I think it's really important that we talk about this stuff.
Right. And speaking of how the language we use, and what are your thoughts? And you were saying most often substance use disorder. What are your thoughts about that as opposed to alcoholism and or addiction?
Well, actually now what's really interesting is the terminology has been changed in all the style guides. I'm a journalist. I was a journalist before, before a lot of things. So in the AP style guide, for example, all of that stuff has been changed from, we don't use addict, we don't use alcoholic. I use alcoholic for myself because that's the word that I happen to identify with. I like
me too.
I like the bluntness of it. I like the in your face of it. But other people, if I was talking about you, I would be referring to you as a person with substance use disorder. So we try to stick with the person first, so that we don't, heap shame on, the fact that you are an addict, or, but as a person in recovery, we all use very different terms for ourselves. And alcoholic is what I call myself. It reminds me that I still am, and at any moment could be an active alcoholic all over again, and all of that could start again. So I need that reminder.
I knew a guy in recovery who would identify himself as an alcoholic and a filthy crack addict, and And it was really for him, to remind him that, where that took him. Your column, The Parent Teacher Conference, ran for over 3 years in the New York Times. And did you, how much did you use it to bring a substance use disorder awareness?
Only towards the very end. When I was writing that column, I was still really struggling. It wasn't until sort of I'd been in that column for a little while that I started to get some perspective. And I've never enjoyed reading books or articles by people who are using their journalism or their writing as their own therapy. So for me, I did a lot of exploration in there. I did interview the kids that I was teaching at the rehab for one article about sort of what in your most open moments could an adult have said to you that would have changed your thinking around using drugs and alcohol. That was a really fun article. Mostly I answered questions that people would send me that they were either that parents were afraid to ask teachers, or that teachers were afraid to say to parents, or that students wanted their teachers to know, or that students wanted their parents to know. So I was at that intersection of education and parenting, and I love that space. That's been the space that I've always worked within.
Sounds like you're very successful in that space. And one last question that we ask all of our guests, which is, what is the best lesson you have learned in sobriety, in recovery?
I have to be honest with myself, with my kids, with, lying is the very thin end. Lying and hiding things. I think I became so good at hiding what I was doing, and that made it okay. If I looked okay to other people, then I was okay. And so I admit when I'm depressed. I admit when I need help. My husband is incredibly supportive of my getting and staying sober, and is really grateful that I did. We would be divorced by now if that hadn't. I'd probably be dead by now if that hadn't happened.
Yeah.
So if I'm feeling if I'm feeling like I'm just not strong enough for us to have that dinner party where people are going to have wine at the dinner party, then we don't have wine at that dinner party. Or if I'm out somewhere with him, we have sort of signal between us that it's time for us to go home, that I feel like I'm just not in a great place to be exposing myself to, drinking or whatever. I have to be honest about that stuff or I'm sunk.
Great lesson and great interview. Thank you, Jess.
Thank you so much. I just have so much fun talking about this stuff.
And everyone, I urge you to get Jess's books, The Gift of Failure, How Parents Learn to Let Go so Their Children Can Succeed, and The Addiction Inoculation, Raising Healthy Kids in a Culture of Dependence. And to all of our listeners, thank you for your continued support. Visit us on soberpodcast.com and all places where you find major podcasts. Sign up for our mailing list, leave us a review. You will also find the contact information and ways to order Jessica Leahy's books in our show notes. And I'm your host, Jamie Brickhouse, where you can find me every day on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, where I tell a true story in high heels every day. Signing out for the Sober Podcast. Tune in for another show next week.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Sober Podcast. We hope that you have found this episode helpful and look forward to you joining us next time. As we continue to grow and implement positive change, we hope that you'll share our podcast with your friends and loved ones. They can find us on all the major podcast directories or at soberpodcast.com. If you have an idea for the show, want to leave positive feedback, ideas, or comments, connect with us at soberpodcast.com. You can also reach out to us on our social media platforms in the Soberverse. We'd love to hear from you. A special thanks to all those who make this show happen. Jamie Brickhouse, our host, Chrissy Senopol, our social media manager, our sponsor, Dr. J and the Sober Network, and me, I'm your executive producer, Nate Kelly. Join us next Saturday for another story of hope and resilience with a notable sober celebrity. And until then, remember that we here at the Sober Network are driven by our mission to help people get sober and stay sober. Bye for now.